Hello, and welcome back to our series on World War I. The war had just broken out, engulfing Europe in a vast and destructive struggle as we left it in 1914. Early battles and the start of the lethal trench warfare on the Western Front were caused by the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, which set off a series of alliances and hostilities. We now follow the development of this worldwide conflict in 1915. The alliance system divided Europe into combatants and neutrals. About the outbreak of the war, the Ottomans remained as a wild card, uncommitted to either bloc. The empire occupied a position of great strategic importance, sandwiched between the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Balkans, the Middle East, and Northern Africa. The Ottoman rulers had actively sought a military alliance to bolster their power, their preferred ally being Britain. Constantinople launched 3 successive attempts to forge an alliance with London, one in 1908, 1911, and 1913, but each failed. For Britain, the strategic advantages of an Ottoman alliance were far outweighed by the risk of having to prop up the crumbling empire. An alliance with Constantinople would also complicate the newly formed alliance between Britain and Russia, the traditional foe of the Ottomans. Germany was more interested in an Ottoman alliance, particularly as war approached. Since 1904, Berlin had been constructing a railway across Ottoman territory to Baghdad. Once completed, this railway would provide easy access to and from ports and oil fields in Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq, to secure a steady supply of oil for military and industrial use. An alliance would secure this Berlin to Baghdad railway. It would give Germany a measure of control over the Bosphorus, a neck of water connecting the Mediterranean with the Black Sea. It would also provide land access to Northern Africa and the Middle East. German-Ottoman negotiations intensified during the July crisis. The ambitious Ottoman leaders, members of the Committee of Union and Progress (CUP), known collectively as the Young Turks, responded favorably to overtures made by Germany in August 1914. Thus, a secret alliance was finally signed on the 2nd of August 1914. The Ottomans did not formally enter World War I until the 29th of October 1914, when their fleet entered the Black Sea and shelled Russian ports there. This brings us to the Gallipoli Campaign, an Anglo-French operation against Turkey, intended to allow the Allied ships to pass through the Dardanelles, capture Constantinople, now Istanbul, and ultimately knock Ottoman Turkey out the war. Plans for an assault on the Ottoman Empire were considered by the British authorities between 1904 and 1911, but military and naval opinion was against it. When war between the Allies and Turkey began early in November 1914, the matter was re-examined and classed as a hazardous but possible operation. With the Western Front slipping into a stalemate, some Allied commanders argued for opening a second front against the weaker Ottomans and Austro-Hungarians. In Britain, the chief advocate for this strategy was Winston Churchill, a young aristocrat who had been appointed First Lord of the Admiralty, akin to the Secretary of the US Navy before his 37th birthday. Many in Britain, notably Churchill, believed that knocking the Ottomans out of the war would undermine Germany. They theorized that because of this attack, Britain and France would be able to help their weakest partner, Russia, that the Suez Canal and Britain's Middle Eastern oil interests would be secured, and that undecided Balkan states, including Bulgaria and Greece, would join the Allied side. It was an exciting and alluring proposition. Churchill held a low opinion of the Ottoman military capacity. He believed its land forces were poorly equipped, organized, and commanded, while the Ottoman Navy relied mainly on decrepit 19th century ships. On the 2nd of January 1915, in response to an appeal by Grand Duke Nicholas, commanding the Russian armies, the British government agreed to stage a demonstration against Turkey to relieve pressure on the Russians on the Caucasus front. The Dardanelles were selected as the place, a combined naval and military operation being strongly supported by Churchill. For centuries, the Dardanelles has been recognized as a strategic advantage. The Dardanelles and its geographical advantage are the link between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean Sea, providing the only way to access Constantinople across seas. Before conflict arose, the Dardanelles, heavily fortified by Turkey, were closed to warships but open to merchant ships. During the first few weeks of World War I, before Turkey declared hostilities, they closed the straits to all shipping, cutting the Allied supply line to Russian Black Sea ports. The Gallipoli Campaign aimed to re-establish this line of trade and communication for munitions into the Black Sea. On the 28th of January, the Dardanelles Committee decided on an attempt to force the straits by naval action alone, using mostly obsolete warships too old for fleet action. On the 16th of February, that decision was modified, as it was agreed that the shores of the Dardanelles would have to be held if the fleet passed through. For that purpose, a large military force under General Sir Ian Hamilton was assembled in Egypt, the French authorities also providing a small contingent. On the 19th of February 1915, British and French ships began a naval assault on the Dardanelles. On the 18th of March, the Anglo-French naval force attempted to blast open the Dardanelles but were unsuccessful. Turkey, recognizing the Dardanelles as an asset to protect, fortified them with shore batteries and minefields, so the Allies sustained heavy damage from Turkish mines and land-based artillery as a result. The Navy abandoned its attack, concluding that the fleet could not succeed without military help. The decision was made for an amphibious landing sometime in April or May to seize control of the Dardanelles coastline and clear it of artillery. This would give Allied ships a clear run to the Sea of Marmara and the Bosphorus, where they could attack Constantinople. An Allied invasion force was hastily organized. Since generals were reluctant to release men from the Western Front, the landing force was comprised mainly of British units stationed in the Middle East, British Empire forces, Australians, New Zealanders, Indians and Canadians, along with 80,000 French troops from Africa. The Ottomans, meanwhile, began preparations for the imminent invasion, assisted by German adjutant Otto Liman von Sanders. While Ottoman troops trained and drilled, defensive positions were built along critical points of the Dardanelles Peninsula, known to the locals as Gallipoli. The coastline was mined. Likely breaches were fenced with barbed wire. Machine gun nests were installed on elevated positions. Though the Allies were confident of victory, the 6-week pause between naval assault and landing would prove fatal. Ottoman forces, though thinly spread and poorly equipped, were well prepared. Troop transports assembled off the Greek island of Lemnos, and landings began on the Gallipoli Peninsula at 2 places early on the 25th of April 1915, at Cape Helles and at Gaziantep on the Asian coast. A French brigade landed on the Anatolian coast opposite Kumkel, but was later withdrawn. Small beachheads were secured with difficulty, the troops at Anzac being held up by Turkish reinforcements under the redoubtable Mustafa Kemal, who later became famous as Ataturk. Large British and Dominion reinforcements followed, yet little progress was made. On the 6th of August, another landing on the west coast at Suvla Bay took place. After some initial progress, the assault was halted. By September 1915, it was clear that without further large reinforcements, there was no hope of decisive results, and the authorities at home decided to recall Hamilton to replace him with Lieutenant General Sir Charles Munro. Due to the failure of the August offensive, it was effectively the end of his military career. Munro recommended the withdrawal of the military forces and abandonment of the enterprise, advice that was confirmed in November by the Secretary of State for War, Lord Kitchener, when he visited the peninsula. That difficult operation was carried out by stages and was successfully completed early on the 9th of January 1916. The campaign was a success only insofar as it attracted large Turkish forces away from the Russians. The attempt to capture the Dardanelles, however, was an unmitigated military disaster, riddled with false assumptions, poor military leadership in some cases, faulty tactics, including complete lack of supplies, and poor planning that cost more than 44,000 Allied lives. According to Sir Ellis Ashmead Bartlett, the British war correspondent for the London Daily Telegraph, the generals had no maps and only a vague idea of the nature of the ground in their front, and no adequate steps taken to keep the troops supplied. The Australian volunteers had nothing to drink in the scorching sun, starving and feverish. In all, some 480,000 Allied forces took part in the Gallipoli Campaign at a cost of more than 250,000 casualties. The date of the landings, April 25th, is marked by Anzac Day, a day of remembrance in Australia and New Zealand. The defense of Gallipoli was the Ottoman Empire's most successful military operation of the war, though the campaign cost an estimated 250,000 casualties, with 65,000 killed. The Dardanelles campaign remains one of the First World War's most controversial episodes. The campaign had serious political and diplomatic repercussions. It gave the impression throughout the world that the Allies were military inept. Before the evacuation, after reports of munitions shortages on the Western Front, squabbles between First Sea Lord Admiral John Fisher, head of the British Navy, and Winston Churchill at the Admiralty, and failures at Gallipoli, H. Asquith's Liberal administration was forced into a coalition government with the Conservatives. Churchill, the chief protagonist of the venture, was demoted Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, a sinecure post whose only major responsibility is to designate county magistrates. In May 1915 and in November that same year, Churchill resigned from government, although he remained an MP, Member of Parliament that is. Churchill went to command an infantry battalion in France. In the end, the campaign hastened Asquith's resignation and his replacement as Prime Minister by David Lloyd George in December 1916. Following the tragic facts of the Gallipoli Campaign, we now turn our attention to the Western Front and one of World War I's most notorious conflicts, the Second Battle of Ypres. This fight, fought in the spring of 1915, saw the Germans conduct a limited offensive around the strategic town of Ypres in Flanders. The battle was a crucial and terrible milestone in military history. It was here that poison gas was first utilized on a big basis, ushering in a new and terrible weapon to the battlefield. The battle involved several key military leaders from both the German and Allied sides. General Albert Duke of Württemberg was the commander of the German Fourth Army, which was primarily responsible for the German offensive during the battle. The Allied forces on the Ypres front comprised elements of the two corps of the British Second Army, which included the 1st Canadian Division, commanded by Sir Horace Smith-Dorrien, the French 45th Algerian and 87th Territorial Divisions under General Henry Putz, and the Belgian 6th Division under Major General Armand de Koenig. Both sides started evaluating their chances of winning the war as trench warfare persisted. Chief of Staff Erich von Falken led German operations and felt that a separate peace could be achieved with Russia. Therefore, he concentrated on winning the war on the Western Front. As early as November 1914, Falken had called for a separate peace agreement with Petrograd, St. Petersburg, as he was not convinced that Germany would ever be able to fight efficiently on two fronts. Falken did not think Germany could defeat the Russian army, so he did not want to waste troops on an attack against Russia. This approach clashed with Generals Paul von Hindenburg and Erich Ludendorff, who wished to deliver a decisive blow in the east. The heroes of Tannenberg, they were able to use their fame and political savvy to influence the German leadership. As a result, the decision was made to focus on the Eastern Front in 1915. In the end, this concentration produced the remarkably effective Görlitz-Tarnow offensive in May. Though Germany had decided on an East-first strategy, Falken began organizing an attack against Ypres, which was scheduled to start in April. He planned a modest offensive with the goals of securing a more dominating position in Flanders, testing poison gas, and deflecting Allied attention away from army movements east from the Görlitz-Tarnow offensive. Toxic smoke had been used occasionally in warfare since ancient times, and in 1912, the French used small amounts of tear gas in police operations. At the outbreak of World War I, however, the Germans began to actively develop chemical weapons. In October 1914, small tear gas canisters were placed in shells that were fired at Neuve-Chapelle, France, but Allied troops were not exposed. In January 1915, the Germans fired shells loaded with xylobromide tear gas, a more lethal gas, at Russian troops at Belimov on the Eastern Front. Because of the wintry cold, most of the gas froze, preventing it from being effective. The Second Battle of Ypres inaugurated the use of lethal chlorine gas, which irritated the lung tissue, causing a choking effect that could cause death. In preparation for the assault, German troops moved 5,730 90-pound canisters of chlorine gas to the front opposite Gravenstaffel Ridge, which was occupied by the French 45th and 87th Divisions. These units were comprised of territorial and colonial troops from Algeria and Morocco. On the 22nd of April 1915, the Germans launched their first and only offensive on the Western Front that year. At around 5 p.m, soldiers from the German Fourth Army started to fire gas cannonballs at the French soldiers stationed at Gravenstaffel. To accomplish this, the gas cylinders were manually opened and the gas was then directed towards the enemy by the dominant winds. It was a risky dispersion technique that cost the German forces many lives. The grey-green cloud hit the French 45th and 87th Divisions as it drifted across the lines, wafting across no man's land and down into their trenches. The French troops were caught off guard and started to withdraw as their fellow soldiers suffered injuries to their lungs and became blinded. Because the gas was denser than air, it filled the trenches and other low-lying locations quickly, pushing the remaining French defenders into the open and into German fire. Soon after, some 8,000 yards of wide space appeared between the Allied lines as about 6,000 French men perished from gas-related injuries. The Germans advanced and reached the Allied lines, but darkness and a shortage of reserves hindered their ability to take advantage of the opening. 2 days later, on the 24th of April, a second gas attack targeted the 1st Canadian Division. The Canadians launched a determined defense and prevented a German breakthrough. It was during this time that Canadian officer John McCrae penned the first lines of the poem In Flanders Fields, as a tribute to a friend who had been killed in the fighting. In Flanders Fields was published in Punch in December 1915, and it became perhaps the best-known poem about World War I. In the weeks that followed, successive attacks and counterattacks by German and Allied forces resulted in further territory loss for the Allies and high casualties on both sides. By May, the Allies had retreated to the town of Ypres. The battle ended on the 25th of May, when the Germans exhausted their resources and were forced to withdraw. The Allies had held their ground and remained in possession of Ypres, but the salient was constricted, and valuable high ground had been lost. A salient is simply a bulge in the line that gives the defenders the advantage of being able to fire on those in the salient from 3 sides. The Allies were left holding a line just outside of Ypres, and though the Germans had failed to break through the Allied lines, they reduced the Ypres salient to around 3 miles, which allowed for the shelling of the city. The British suffered around 59,275 casualties, while the Germans endured 34,933. In addition, the French incurred around 10,000. The Ypres salient saw heavy casualties from German artillery and attacks for the next 2 years. The gas attacks on the first day of the battle became one of the conflict's great missed opportunities. Had the assault been backed with sufficient reserves, it may have broken through Allied lines. The use of poison gas had come as a tactical surprise to the Allies, who roundly condemned its use as barbaric and reprehensible. Though many neutral nations agreed with this assessment, it didn't stop the Allies from developing their own gas weapons, which debuted at Loos that September. With the Germans taking the lead, an extensive number of projectiles filled with deadly substances polluted the trenches during the next several years of war. Military strategists defended the use of poison gas by saying it reduced the enemy's ability to respond and thus saved lives in offensives. Defenses against poison gas usually kept pace with offensive developments, and both sides employed sophisticated gas masks and protective clothing that eventually negated the strategic importance of chemical weapons. Following the gas attack at Ypres, Allied forces were initially provided with cotton pads to cover their mouths, soaked in chemicals or sometimes urine, and goggles. Over the course of the war, more effective respirators were developed. On the 4th of August, as World War I erupted across Europe, President Woodrow Wilson proclaimed America's neutrality, stating the nation must be neutral in fact as well as in name during these days that are to try men's souls. With no vital interest at stake, many Americans supported this position. As the war persisted and the destruction spread, many Americans could not ignore the crisis anymore. Wilson's initial hope that America could be impartial in thought as well as in action was soon compromised by Germany's attempted quarantine at the British Isles. On the 4th of February 1915, Germany declared a war zone around Britain in which any shipping, military or civilian, would be sunk on sight. Immediately after the outbreak of the war, the British had instituted an economic blockade of Germany, with the aim of preventing all supplies reaching that country from the outside world. Germany was retaliating against the Allies for the British-imposed blockade of Germany in the North Sea. During the early stages of the war, U-boats followed prize rules. They would surface before attacking merchant ships, carry out formal searches of the cargo, and allow time for passengers and crew to escape before the ship was sunk. Germany eventually abandoned prize rules and began its campaign of unrestricted submarine warfare, partially due to the British introduction of Q-ships, warships disguised as merchant ships. As political tensions mounted in the build-up to the First World War, the British government invested heavily in merchant shipping to ensure the availability of naval auxiliaries should war break out. In 1903, the government agreed to subsidize the construction of two Gernot ocean liners, sister ships Lusitania and Mauretania, on the provision that they could be requisitioned in the event of war and that they were specially designed for rapid conversion into armed merchant cruisers. Construction began in 1904, and after completion of the hull and main superstructure, the Lusitania was launched on the 7th of June 1906. The liners of this size, however, were not used as armed merchant cruisers in the end because of their enormous fuel consumption. They were instead used as troop ships and hospital ships because of their unrivaled speed and size, which far exceeded that of Navy ships. While the Mauretania served in both capacities in the First World War, the Lusitania did not. In May 1915, the Lusitania was returning from New York to Liverpool with 1,959 passengers and crew on board. Several New York newspapers published a warning by the German embassy in Washington that Americans traveling on British or Allied ships in war zones did so at their own risk. The announcement was placed on the same page as an advertisement for the imminent sailing of the British-owned Lusitania ocean liner from New York to Liverpool. Moreover, the sinkings of merchant ships off the south coast of Ireland and reports of submarine activity there prompted the British Admiralty to warn the Lusitania to avoid the area and to recommend adopting the evasive tactic of zigzagging, changing course every few minutes at irregular intervals to confuse any attempt by U-boats to plot her course for torpedoing. The ship's captain, William Thomas Turner, chose to ignore these recommendations, and on the afternoon of the 7th of May, the vessel was attacked. A torpedo struck and exploded amidships on the starboard side, and a heavy explosion followed, possibly caused by damage to the ship's steam engines and pipes. Within 20 minutes, the Lusitania had sunk, and 1,198 people were drowned. The loss of the liner and so many of its passengers, including 128 US citizens, aroused a wave of indignation in the United States, and it was fully expected that a declaration of war would follow, but the US government clung to its policy of neutrality. As word spread about Lusitania's tragic fate, so did the outrage. American citizens were saddened and stunned, but not ready to rush to war. President Woodrow Wilson wanted to proceed with caution and remain neutral, while former President Theodore Roosevelt demanded swift retaliation. Although the Lusitania was a commercial passenger liner, it was registered with the British Admiralty as an armed auxiliary cruiser, carrying munitions and other military goods. The Lusitania was carrying a cargo of rifle ammunition and shells for Britain, together about 173 tons. The Germans, who had circulated warnings that the ship would be sunk, felt themselves fully justified in attacking a vessel that was furthering the war aims of their enemy. The German government also felt that, in view of the vulnerability of U-boats while on the surface and the British announcement of intentions to arm merchant ships, warning of potential targets was impractical. As they continued to divert blame, British propaganda against them snowballed. Throngs of vengeance-seeking Brits rushed to enlist, and an anti-German riots broke out in London. The poor babies who perished in the ocean struck a blow at German power more deadly than could have been achieved by the sacrifice of 100,000 men, said Winston Churchill. On the 19th of August 1915, a German submarine sunk the British ocean liner SS Arabic and claimed self-defense. The event further strained diplomatic relations between the United States and Germany. President Wilson warned Germany that if it was determined they'd sunk the ship without cause, the United States may cut diplomatic ties and enter the war. Following immense pressure from the US and recognizing the limited effectiveness of the policy, on the 1st of September, Germany announced they would no longer sink passenger ships without warning. Satisfied, at least for the moment, President Wilson chose not to declare war on Germany despite being encouraged otherwise by some of his cabinet members. On the 23rd of May 1915, another major player entered the fray, Italy. Initially part of the Triple Alliance with Germany and Austria-Hungary, Italy's entry into the war on the side of the Allies marked a dramatic shift in alliances and introduced a new theatre of war. When World War I broke out in the summer of 1914, Italy declared itself neutral in the conflict, despite its membership in the Triple Alliance alongside Germany and Austria-Hungary since 1882. Over the course of the month that followed, Italy and its leaders weighed their options. Wooed by both sides, they carefully considered how to gain the greatest benefit from participation in the war. The decision to join the fray on the side of the Allies was based largely on the assurances Italy received in the Treaty of London, signed in April 1915. Great Britain, France, and Russia concluded, on April 26, 1915, the secret Treaty of London with Italy, inducing the latter to discard the obligations of the Triple Alliance and to enter the war on the side of the Allies by the promise of territorial aggrandizement at Austria-Hungary's expense. The Triple Entente countries saw a way of weakening the Central Powers by opening a new front and thus splitting them still further with a Western, Eastern, and now Southern front. Thus, on May 23, 1915, Italy accordingly declared war on Austria-Hungary. The Italian declaration opened a new front in World War I, stretching 6,000 kilometers, most of them mountainous, along Italy's border with Austria-Hungary. Italy, which had become a unified nation only as recently as 1859, was like Russia, not yet a fully industrialized power, and was still largely an agricultural country with a weak economy. It lacked both the large military and industrial base of her enemies and was certainly not prepared for a large-scale warfare. Despite being numerically superior, it managed to mobilize 1.2 million men in the spring of 1915. The Italian army were poorly equipped, possessing equipment for just 732,000. They lacked strategic leadership and were unable to move equipment and supply lines quickly. Upon declaring war, the Italian army immediately advanced into the South Tyrol region and into the Isonzo River, where Austro-Hungarian troops met them with a stiff defense. The snowy and treacherous terrain made the region poorly suited to offensive operations. The Austrians owned the higher ground as well, so consequently, after several quick Italian success on the Isonzo front, combat settled into a stalemate. As in the Western Front, it became trench warfare with the Italian army repeatedly attacking Austria, making little or no progress and suffering heavy losses. Unlike the Western Front, however, the main difference was the fact that the trenches had to be dug in the alpine rocks and glaciers instead of in the mud, and often up to 3,000 meters of altitude. As 1915 ended, it was clear that the First World War would not be a brief battle, but rather a prolonged, catastrophic conflict with no immediate end in sight. The effects of the conflict were immense, laying the groundwork for subsequent escalation and eventual widespread societal change. See you in the next video.